The clock on the wall showed 8:30 in the evening. Isabella wiped down another table, her feet aching from the long shift. She had been working at Romano's Italian restaurant since 3 in the afternoon, and the dinner rush showed no signs of slowing down. The smell of garlic bread and tomato sauce filled the air as she carried plates back and forth from the kitchen. Romano's wasn't just any restaurant. It sat in the heart of the city, with white tablecloths, crystal wine glasses, and prices that made most people think twice before walking in. Isabella had been working there for almost 2 years now, saving every penny she could. The tips were good, and she needed them. College tuition didn't pay itself, and neither did rent in this expensive city. She tucked a strand of dark hair behind her ear and headed to table 7 with a warm smile. A middle-aged man in an expensive suit had just walked in with 5 other people, all dressed like they'd come straight from a board meeting. The man led the group, talking loudly and gesturing with his hands. Isabella recognized him immediately. His name was Richard, and he came to Romano's at least twice a month. The staff had mixed feelings about Richard. He tipped well, which was good, but he also had a way of making everyone around him feel small. He spoke to waiters like they were invisible until he needed something. He snapped his fingers to get attention. He sent food back to the kitchen for reasons that seemed made up. Tonight he seemed particularly full of himself, probably trying to impress his business guests. "Good evening," Isabella said politely as she approached their table. "Welcome to Romano's. Can I start you off with some drinks?" Richard barely looked at her. He was too busy telling his companions about some deal he'd just closed. Isabella stood there patiently, her notepad ready, waiting for a break in the conversation. After what felt like forever, Richard turned to her with an annoyed expression, as if she had interrupted him rather than the other way around. "We'll have a bottle of your most expensive red wine," he said dismissively, "and bring some of those fancy appetizers. Whatever costs the most." Isabella nodded and wrote down the order. She was used to customers like this. You smile, you take the order, you bring the food, and you don't take it personally. That's what her manager always said. In the service industry, you meet all kinds of people, and the difficult ones teach you patience. As she turned to leave, she heard Richard's voice boom across the dining room. "This place is supposed to be high class, right? Where's the atmosphere? Where's the live music?" Isabella paused. She glanced toward the corner of the restaurant where a beautiful grand piano sat. It was a stunning instrument, dark and polished, catching the light from the chandeliers above. The piano had been there for years, and it used to be played every evening by an old man named Vincent. He would fill the restaurant with soft jazz and classical pieces that made the food taste even better. But Vincent had retired 6 months ago and moved away to live with his daughter. Since then, the piano had sat silent like a piece of beautiful furniture that nobody touched. Richard stood up from his chair and walked over to the piano. He ran his hand along its surface dramatically, then turned to face the entire restaurant. "A place like this should have live music," he announced loudly. "Don't you agree, everyone?" Several diners looked up from their meals, unsure how to respond. Some nodded politely. Others looked uncomfortable with the sudden disruption. Richard seemed to feed off the attention. The manager, Tony, hurried over from the host stand. Tony was a kind man in his 50s who'd been running Romano's for 20 years. He approached Richard with a professional smile. "I apologize, sir. Our pianist retired some months ago, and we haven't yet found a suitable replacement. But I assure you the ambiance—" "Excuses," Richard cut him off. "A restaurant of this caliber should always have entertainment."
"What do I pay these prices for?"
Tony's smile became strained. "I completely understand your concern, sir. Perhaps next time we can—" "Next time?" Richard laughed, but it wasn't a friendly sound. "I'm here now. My associates are here now. We're celebrating a major business deal, and you're telling me we have to eat in silence?" Isabella watched from near the kitchen door, feeling sorry for Tony. She knew how hard he worked to keep everyone happy. The restaurant meant everything to him. He treated the staff like family and always stood up for them when customers got too demanding. But Richard was a regular customer who spent a lot of money, and losing him would hurt the business. Then something happened that made Isabella's stomach drop. Richard turned and pointed directly at her. "You," he called out. "Waitress, come here." Isabella's heart started beating faster. She walked over slowly, wondering what she'd done wrong. Had she forgotten something? Was he unhappy with the service? "Yes, sir. How can I help you?" Richard looked her up and down, then smiled. It wasn't a kind smile. I heard you talking to another customer last week. Something about music classes. You play piano, don't you? Isabella's face went pale. She had mentioned it just once in a casual conversation with a regular customer who'd asked about her studies. It had been a brief comment, nothing more. How did Richard remember that?
Why did he remember that?
I used to study music, yes, she said quietly. Perfect. Richard clapped his hands together. Then you can play for us. Problem solved. The restaurant went quiet. Every conversation stopped. Everyone turned to look at what was happening. Isabella felt dozens of eyes on her and her hands began to shake. Sir, I'm working right now. I need to serve the tables. Tony here can handle that, can't you, Tony? Richard said, not waiting for an answer. Come on, don't be shy. My party deserves some entertainment and you clearly know how to play. Unless you lied about studying music? Isabella looked at Tony, silently begging him to help. Tony looked torn. She could see the conflict on his face. He wanted to protect her, but he also couldn't afford to lose an important customer. The restaurant business was tough, and Richard came here often with different groups of wealthy clients. Isabella isn't really a performer, Tony tried to explain gently. She's studying business management, actually. The music was just what? Richard interrupted again. Look, it's simple. Either she plays something for us or I'm taking my business elsewhere. And I'll make sure everyone in my network knows that Romano's has terrible service. The threat hung in the air. Isabella felt sick. This wasn't fair. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just trying to work, to earn money for school, to get through another day. And now this man was putting her on the spot in front of everyone, forcing her to either humiliate herself or cause problems for Tony and the restaurant she cared about. Her hands wouldn't stop shaking. The piano sat there in the corner, looking both inviting and terrifying at the same time. She hadn't played in front of anyone in 3 years. Not since everything changed. Not since the accident. Not since her whole life fell apart and she had to give up everything she loved. But now, with everyone watching and waiting, she didn't seem to have a choice. Richard stood there with his arms crossed, a smug look on his face, confident that he'd get his way. His business associates looked embarrassed but said nothing. The other diners watched with a mixture of curiosity and sympathy. Isabella took a deep breath. Her throat felt tight and her eyes stung with the beginning of tears she refused to let fall. She slowly untied her apron with trembling fingers and handed it to Tony. He took it reluctantly, his eyes apologetic. I'm so sorry, he whispered. Isabella didn't respond. She couldn't trust her voice. Instead, she walked toward the piano, each step feeling heavier than the last. The restaurant remained silent except for the soft sound of her shoes on the hardwood floor. When she reached the piano bench, she stood there for a moment, staring down at the keys hidden beneath the closed lid. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. This wasn't the life she had planned. But life rarely went according to plan, did it? She sat down on the bench, lifted the lid, and placed her hands above the keys. They hovered there, frozen, as 3 years of buried memories came flooding back. Isabella's hands hovered over the piano keys, but she couldn't bring herself to touch them. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought everyone in the restaurant must be able to hear it. The last time she'd sat at a piano like this, everything had been different. She'd been different. 3 years ago, music had been her entire world. She'd lived and breathed it since she was 6 years old. Her parents had saved for years to buy her a used piano, and she'd spent every free moment practicing. By the time she was in high school, teachers were calling her gifted, talented, special. They said she had a future in music, a real one. Not just as a hobby, but as a career. She'd gotten accepted to the city's best music conservatory with a full scholarship. It was a dream come true. For 2 years, she studied under the best instructors, practiced 8 hours a day, and performed in recitals that left audiences speechless. Her professors talked about concerts, recordings, a professional career. Her parents beamed with pride every time they heard her play. Then came the accident. Isabella closed her eyes, trying to push the memory away. But sitting here at this piano, it all came flooding back. The rainy night. The intersection. The sound of metal crunching. The pain, the hospital, the surgery on her hands. The doctor's careful words about nerve damage and uncertain recovery. The physical therapy that hurt so much she cried every session. But worse than the physical pain was what came after. Her parents were gone. The funeral. The medical bills that kept coming. The realization that her scholarship required her to perform in concerts and recitals, which she couldn't do anymore. The slow understanding that everything she'd worked for, everything she'd dreamed of, was slipping away. She'd tried to go back. She really had. But every time she sat at the piano, her hands would shake. Sometimes from the lingering physical effects of the injury. Sometimes from fear. What if she couldn't play anymore? What if she'd lost it? What if the one thing that made her special was gone forever? Eventually, it became easier to just stop trying. She'd dropped out of the conservatory, changed her name slightly so people wouldn't ask questions, and started working. First one job, then two, then three. She needed money for the medical debt, for rent, for food. There was no time for music. No energy for dreams. She told herself it was temporary, that she'd go back someday. But temporary had turned into 3 years, and the piano had become something she avoided thinking about. And now here she was, being forced to play in front of strangers by a man who had no idea what he was asking of her. She opened her eyes and looked down at the keys. 88 black and white rectangles that had once felt like home. Her fingers trembled as she slowly lowered them to touch the cool ivory. The feel of it sent a jolt through her body, a mixture of joy and pain so intense she almost pulled away. Behind her, someone coughed. The sound snapped her back to reality. The entire restaurant was watching, waiting, judging. Richard stood near his table with his arms crossed, that smug look still on his face. His business associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Other diners had stopped eating completely, their attention fixed on the drama unfolding in the corner. Tony stood by the kitchen door, wringing his hands. He looked like he wanted to rescue her but didn't know how. The other waitstaff had gathered near him, whispering to each other. Isabella could feel their sympathy, but it didn't help. Nothing could help now except getting through this. She took a deep breath and tried to think. What could she play? Something simple, she decided. Something easy that wouldn't show how rusty she was, how much she'd forgotten, how weak her hands had become from 3 years of carrying trays instead of playing scales. Her fingers found their position almost automatically. Muscle memory, her old teacher used to call it. The body remembers even when the mind wants to forget. She chose a simple piece, something everyone would recognize, something she'd played 1,000 times as a child. The first note came out soft and hesitant, then another, then another. She was playing, actually playing, and nothing terrible was happening. Her hands weren't failing. The notes were coming out clear and true, but something was wrong. Not with the playing itself, but with how it felt. The music sounded mechanical, lifeless, like a music box playing a pre-programmed tune. There was no soul in it, no emotion. She was hitting all the right notes, but it was empty. Anyone could tell. She heard someone whisper, "Is that it?" Someone else murmured something about expecting more from someone who'd studied music. Richard let out a disappointed sigh, loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. Isabella felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment. This was exactly what she'd been afraid of. She wasn't the musician she used to be. 3 years away had broken something inside her. Something that couldn't be fixed by just putting her fingers on the keys. She almost stopped, almost stood up and walked away, ready to quit her job if necessary. Anything to escape this humiliation. But then something shifted inside her chest. A spark of anger maybe, or defiance, or maybe just exhaustion with running away from who she used to be. Why was she playing it safe? What did she have to lose at this point? Her dignity was already gone. Her dreams were already dead. Richard had already humiliated her in front of everyone. The worst had already happened, so instead of stopping, she changed course. Her hands lifted off the keys for just a moment, and then they came down again with a different intention. She abandoned the simple melody and shifted into something more complex, more real, a piece she'd once performed at her final recital at the conservatory, just weeks before the accident. The music changed completely. The mechanical feeling disappeared, replaced by something raw and powerful. Her fingers moved faster, more confidently, dancing across the keys with a skill that seemed impossible for a waitress who claimed to have only studied music briefly. The notes tumbled out like water breaking through a dam. Everything she'd kept locked inside for 3 years poured into the music. The grief, the loss, the frustration, the dreams that died, the person she used to be crying out against the person she'd become. Her hands flew across the keys, and she forgot about the restaurant, forgot about Richard, forgot about the audience watching her. She was back in the conservatory practice room at 2 in the morning, working on a difficult passage until her hands ached. She was on stage at her first recital, nervous but excited. She was 10 years old, playing for her parents in their tiny living room, seeing the pride in their eyes. She was every version of herself that had ever loved music all at once coming back to life through her fingertips. Tears started rolling down her cheeks, but she didn't stop playing. Couldn't stop. The music had taken over and she was just along for the ride. Her body swayed slightly with the rhythm. Her foot worked the pedals without conscious thought. This was what she'd been missing. This was what she'd tried to bury and forget. The technical difficulty of the piece increased, but her hands didn't falter. A particularly challenging run of notes came out perfectly, then a series of complex chords that required strength and precision. Her injured hands, the ones doctors had worried about, the ones she'd been so afraid had lost their ability, were working beautifully, better than beautifully. They were creating magic. The restaurant had gone completely silent. Even the kitchen sounds had stopped. The staff had come out to listen, standing frozen with dishes in their hands. Diners sat with forks halfway to their mouths, forgotten. An elderly woman at a corner table had tears streaming down her face. A young couple held hands, mesmerized. Even the businessman who'd been checking his phone throughout his meal had put it down and was staring. Richard's expression had completely changed. The smugness was gone, replaced by shock and something that looked like the beginning of shame. He'd expected a waitress to stumble through a simple tune to amuse his clients. He hadn't expected this. Nobody had expected this. Isabella transitioned into another piece without pause, this one even more emotional. The notes seemed to speak what words couldn't express. Every person listening felt something different, but everyone felt something. That's what real music does. It reaches past the surface, past the walls people build, and touches something true and human underneath. Her playing grew softer, more delicate, like a whisper after a shout. The melody became haunting, beautiful in a way that made your chest ache. This was the language she'd lost, the way she used to speak before life taught her to be quiet and invisible and safe. As the piece built toward its conclusion, Isabella finally opened her eyes. She'd been playing blind from memory and feeling. Now she saw the restaurant full of stunned faces. She saw Tony with his hand over his mouth. She saw other staff members crying. She saw strangers moved by something they didn't understand but couldn't look away from. And she saw Richard standing completely still, his face pale, all the arrogance drained away. He looked like someone who'd just realized he'd made a terrible mistake but didn't know how to fix it. Isabella's hands lifted off the keys, and the last note hung in the air, fading slowly into silence. For a moment, nothing happened. The last note of Isabella's performance faded into complete silence. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. It was as if the entire restaurant had forgotten how to breathe. Then someone started clapping. It was the elderly woman in the corner, the one who'd been crying. She stood up slowly, her hands coming together in steady, deliberate applause. Then another person joined her. Then another. Within seconds, the entire restaurant erupted. People weren't just clapping politely like they might for background music. They were on their feet, applauding with real enthusiasm, the kind reserved for concert halls and professional performances. Isabella sat frozen at the piano, her hands still resting on the keys. She couldn't process what was happening. The sound of applause washed over her like a wave, overwhelming and unexpected. Some people were wiping their eyes. Others were shaking their heads in disbelief. A young man near the window kept saying, "Wow," over and over. Tony was the first to reach her. He put his hand on her shoulder, and when she looked up at him, she saw tears in his eyes. "Isabella," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "Why didn't you tell me? All this time I had no idea." She didn't know how to answer. How could she explain that she'd spent 3 years trying to forget this part of herself? That admitting she was a musician would have made the loss too real, too painful. The elderly woman who'd started the applause made her way through the crowd toward the piano. She moved with purpose, her designer handbag clutched in one hand. As she got closer, Isabella noticed her elegant clothing, her perfectly styled silver hair, the way other diners seemed to recognize her and whisper as she passed. "My dear girl," the woman said, her accent revealing years of classical training in her speech. "Do you have any idea what you just did?" Isabella shook her head, still dazed. The woman's eyes were sharp and intelligent despite her age. She studied Isabella's face carefully, as if trying to remember something. "What's your full name, child?" "Isabella Mitchell," she answered automatically, using the middle name she'd adopted after the accident. The woman's eyebrows rose. "Mitchell? Not Morrison?" Isabella's heart stopped. Nobody had called her that in 3 years. Nobody in this restaurant knew her real last name. She'd been so careful to leave that identity behind. How did you—" "Isabella Morrison," the woman said, louder now, her voice carrying across the restaurant. "The scholarship student from the conservatory. The prodigy who disappeared 3 years ago without explanation." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Several people pulled out their phones, typing quickly. Within moments, someone gasped. "Oh my God, there are articles about her. Look at this." Isabella wanted to sink into the floor. This was her nightmare. Being recognized. Being reminded of everything she'd lost. She'd changed her name, taken these service jobs, hidden herself away precisely to avoid this moment. But the phones were out now, and the information was spreading. People were reading aloud in hushed, excited voices. Child prodigy accepted to the conservatory at 16. Rising star in the classical music world. Disappeared from public performances in 2020. Mystery surrounds promising pianist's withdrawal from major debut. A businessman held up his phone, showing a photo from an old newspaper article. It was Isabella at 19, sitting at a piano in formal concert attire, smiling confidently at the camera. She looked so young in the photo, so sure of herself and her future. She barely recognized that girl anymore. "I remember reading about you," a woman at a nearby table said. "There was talk that you might be the next great concert pianist. My daughter studies music, and her teachers used you as an example of dedication and talent. What happened?" The question hung in the air. Everyone was looking at her, waiting for an answer. Isabella felt exposed, vulnerable, like someone had ripped off a bandage from a wound that hadn't healed. The elderly woman seemed to sense her discomfort. She sat down on the piano bench beside Isabella and took her hand gently. "My name is Catherine Brennan," she said quietly, though others could still hear. "I taught at the conservatory for 40 years before I retired. I never had the privilege of teaching you, but I attended several of your performances. You were extraordinary then, but what you just played now, that was something even more remarkable." Isabella looked down at their joined hands. Catherine's fingers were aged and spotted, but they had the same strength and grace that came from a lifetime of playing piano. These were hands that understood. "I heard about the accident," Catherine continued, her voice softer. "The car crash. Your parents. I heard you'd been injured and had to leave the program. The music community mourned your loss. We all wondered what became of you." "The medical bills," Isabella finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My hands needed surgery. There was nerve damage. The doctor said I might not play the same way again. And without my parents, I had no way to pay for school, even with the scholarship. The scholarship required public performances, and I was too afraid." "Afraid of what?" Catherine asked gently. "That I wouldn't be good enough anymore. That the injury had taken away my talent. That I'd stand up to play and fail in front of everyone." The words came tumbling out now. It was easier to just walk away, to become someone else, someone who didn't have all those expectations and dreams and disappointments attached to them. Another woman in the crowd spoke up, her voice kind. "But your hands, they're clearly healed. What you just played was technically perfect. Surely you must have known." Isabella shook her head. "I haven't touched a piano in 3 years. Not until tonight. I was too scared to find out if I could still do it." The restaurant buzzed with whispers. People were moved by her story, touched by the tragedy of it. A talented young woman brought down by circumstances beyond her control, hiding herself away out of fear and grief. It was the kind of story that made people's hearts ache. Richard, who'd been standing near his table looking increasingly uncomfortable, finally stepped forward. His business associates remained seated, clearly wanting no part of what was about to happen. His face had lost all its earlier arrogance. He looked sick, actually physically ill. I need to apologize," he said, his voice cracking slightly. Everyone turned to look at him. "I had no idea. I was just trying to show off in front of my colleagues. I wanted entertainment." I didn't think about how it would make you feel. I didn't think at all. Isabella looked at him. She could see genuine remorse in his eyes now, but she also felt a strange sense of gratitude that confused her. Yes, he'd humiliated her. Yes, he'd forced her into an impossible situation, but he'd also pushed her to do something she'd been too afraid to do on her own. You gave me something tonight, she said slowly, surprising everyone, including herself. You forced me to face the thing I've been running from for 3 years. You made me sit at this piano and discover that my hands still work, that I can still play, that maybe I didn't lose everything in that accident after all. Richard looked startled by her response. He seemed to be expecting anger, maybe threats, but not this measured grace. Still, he insisted, what I did was wrong. The way I spoke to you, the way I demanded rather than asked, the way I put you on the spot, none of that was acceptable regardless of the outcome. A young man in the crowd was recording on his phone. Isabella noticed several others were doing the same. In the age of social media, this moment was already being captured, already being shared. By morning, the video would probably be everywhere. The mysterious waitress who turned out to be a missing prodigy. The forced performance that revealed hidden talent. The story had all the elements that made things go viral. Catherine squeezed Isabella's hand. What will you do now, dear? You can't go back to hiding after this. The world has seen what you can do. Isabella looked down at the piano keys. Her fingers traced the edge of one ivory key, feeling its familiar shape. For 3 years, she'd convinced herself that this chapter of her life was closed. That Isabella Morrison, the pianist, had died in that car crash along with her parents, and only Isabella Mitchell, the waitress, had survived. But sitting here now, with the warmth of applause still lingering in the air, with Catherine's wise eyes watching her carefully, with dozens of strangers who'd been moved by her music, she realized something important. You can't kill a part of yourself just because it hurts to remember. The music had always been there waiting. Her hands had healed even though she'd been too afraid to test them. The talent hadn't disappeared. She had just locked it away. I don't know, she admitted to Catherine. I've spent so long being afraid. I'm not even sure I remember how to be anything else. Catherine smiled. The kind of smile that comes from decades of teaching scared students to be brave. Fear is normal, child. But you've already done the hardest part. You've played again. Everything else is just details. Tony approached with a glass of water, which Isabella accepted gratefully. Her hands were shaking again, but this time from adrenaline rather than fear. Take all the time you need, he told her. The other staff can cover your tables. You've given us all something special tonight. Around the restaurant, conversations had started again, but they were all about what they'd just witnessed. People were sharing the videos, calling friends, texting family members. The food had gone cold on many plates, forgotten in the excitement. Isabella stood up from the piano bench on unsteady legs. She felt exhausted, emotionally drained, but also strangely alive in a way she hadn't felt in years. The future was uncertain and terrifying, but for the first time since the accident it also held possibility. Isabella barely slept that night. She lay in her small studio apartment staring at the ceiling, replaying everything that had happened at Romano's. Her phone kept buzzing with notifications, but she'd turned it face down on her nightstand hours ago. She was afraid to look. When morning finally came, she made herself coffee and sat on the edge of her worn couch. The apartment was tiny, just one room with a bathroom, but it was all she could afford while paying off the medical debt. There was no piano here, no space for one even if she could afford it. She designed her life to be small and simple, free from anything that reminded her of what she'd lost. But last night had changed everything. She finally picked up her phone. The screen was filled with missed calls, text messages, and social media notifications. Her hands trembled as she opened the first video. Someone had posted her performance online, and it had been shared thousands of times already. The comment section was filled with reactions. This made me cry. Who is this woman? The way she plays is unreal. I can't believe she's been working as a waitress. Someone needs to get her back on stage. Another video had even more views. This one included Catherine explaining who Isabella really was, her voice clear in the restaurant's silence. This is Isabella Morrison, one of the most promising piano students the conservatory has ever seen. She disappeared 3 years ago after a tragedy, and tonight we discovered she's been here all along. Isabella's eyes filled with tears as she read through the comments. Strangers from around the world were moved by her story. Some shared their own experiences with loss and fear. Others tagged music schools and performance venues. A few classical music critics had even weighed in, saying they remembered her early performances and calling last night's playing a phoenix rising from the ashes. Her phone rang, making her jump. It was an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her press accept. Hello? Is this Isabella Morrison? A woman's voice, professional and warm. Yes, this is she. My name is Patricia Wells. I'm a program director at the Riverside Concert Hall. I saw the video of your performance last night and I had to reach out. We have an opening in 3 months for our Emerging Artists series. Would you be interested in performing? Isabella's breath caught in her throat. The Riverside Concert Hall was one of the most prestigious venues in the city. She'd dreamed of playing there as a student. I don't know what to say. Say you'll think about it, Patricia suggested kindly. I know this must be overwhelming, but what you did last night was special. The world should hear you play again. After they hung up, Isabella sat in stunned silence. 3 more calls came in that morning. A music academy wanted to offer her a teaching position. A recording studio wanted to discuss a possible album. A talent agent wanted to represent her. It was too much, too fast. Yesterday she'd been invisible, just another waitress in a city full of them. Today everyone wanted something from her. Around noon there was a knock on her door. Isabella opened it cautiously and found Catherine standing in the hallway, holding a large bag from the bakery down the street. I hope I'm not intruding, Catherine said. Tony gave me your address. I thought you might need a friend today. Isabella felt relief wash over her. She stepped aside to let Catherine in. The older woman looked around the small apartment without judgment, then set the bag on the counter. I brought pastries and coffee. I figured you probably weren't eating. She was right. Isabella hadn't thought about food at all. They sat together on the couch and Catherine poured coffee from a thermos she'd brought. For a few minutes they just sat in comfortable silence. Your phone's been ringing, hasn't it? Catherine finally said. Isabella nodded. Constantly. Concert halls, schools, agents. I don't know how they all got my number. That's how the music world works. Once word gets out about real talent, everyone wants a piece of it. Catherine took a sip of her coffee. How are you feeling about all of this? Terrified, Isabella admitted. 3 years ago I had a path. I knew where I was going. Then the accident happened and that path disappeared. I built a new life, a smaller one, but at least it was safe. And now that's being torn away too. Catherine set down her cup and looked at Isabella with those sharp, intelligent eyes. Can I tell you something? I taught piano for 4 decades. I've seen hundreds of students come through the conservatory. Some were technically perfect but had no soul. Others had passion but lacked discipline. Very rarely, maybe once or twice in a career, you meet someone who has both. Someone who can make an instrument speak in a way that touches something deep in the human heart. She paused, making sure Isabella was listening. You're one of those rare ones. What you did last night wasn't just about hitting the right notes. You told a story without words. You made a room full of strangers feel something real. That's a gift, Isabella. And it's not something you can just walk away from. But what if I fail? Isabella's voice was small. What if last night was a fluke? What if my hands can't hold up under the pressure of real performances? What if people expect too much and I disappoint them? Then you'll disappoint them, Catherine said simply. You'll have a bad performance like every musician does sometimes, and you'll learn from it and do better next time. Fear of failure is what's been holding you back, but failure isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. What is? Never trying. Spending the rest of your life wondering what might have been. Looking back when you're my age and realizing you let fear steal your dreams. Catherine reached over and took Isabella's hand. The accident took your parents from you. Don't let it take your music too. Those words hit Isabella like a physical blow. She'd never thought about it that way. By hiding from the piano, by refusing to play, she'd let the accident keep stealing from her long after the physical wounds had healed. I don't even have a piano to practice on, Isabella said, gesturing around her tiny apartment. I can't afford one. I'm still paying off medical bills, Catherine smiled. That's actually why I'm here. I have a proposal for you. My house has 3 pianos. One of them sits in my music room and rarely gets played anymore. My hands aren't what they used to be, and I don't teach private students anymore. The piano is just sitting there waiting. Isabella's heart started beating faster. Come live with me, Catherine continued. I have a guest house in my backyard. It's small but comfortable, and it's yours rent-free. In exchange, you practice every day. You work with me to prepare for performances, and you help me with some light housework. My daughter keeps insisting I need someone around anyway. I can't accept that, Isabella protested. It's too generous. You don't even know me. I know your music. I know your character from how you handled yourself last night. And I know potential when I see it. Besides, I'm a selfish old woman. I miss having music in my house. I miss working with talented students. You'd actually be doing me a favor. Isabella felt tears welling up again. The universe seemed to be conspiring to push her back toward the life she'd run from. Every door she'd closed was being opened again, whether she liked it or not. Her phone buzzed. Another message. This one was from Tony at Romano's. The video hit 2 million views. People are calling the restaurant asking about you. Also, Richard came by this morning. Left an envelope for you. Says it's important. Isabella showed the message to Catherine, who raised her eyebrows. Well, that's interesting. Are you going to work today? I'm supposed to. Evening shift. Isabella had almost forgotten about her job and all the chaos. The normal life she'd built felt like it was slipping away. Go, Catherine encouraged. See what Richard wants. Talk to Tony. Get some sense of normalcy. Then come to my house tomorrow. And we'll talk seriously about your future. No pressure, just options. Deal? Isabella nodded slowly. Deal. That evening, she walked into Romano's through the back entrance, hoping to avoid any attention. But the moment she stepped into the kitchen, the entire staff erupted in applause. The cooks, the dishwashers, the other servers, even the busboys, they all stopped working to celebrate her. Our famous pianist. One of the cooks shouted, grinning widely. Tony emerged from his office with a huge smile on his face. Isabella. The phone hasn't stopped ringing. People want reservations, just hoping you might play again. We've been booked solid for the next 2 weeks. He handed her an envelope. Richard left this for you this morning. He seemed very serious about you getting it. Isabella opened the envelope with shaking hands. Inside was a check. When she saw the amount, she nearly dropped it. $50,000. There was also a handwritten note on expensive paper. Isabella, no amount of money can undo what I did or how I treated you. But I want to help in the only way I know how. This should cover your medical debt and give you time to pursue music without worrying about bills. Consider it an investment in talent that deserves to be heard. I've also established a scholarship fund at the conservatory in your parents' names for students facing financial hardship. Perhaps some good can come from my arrogance after all. Please accept this with my deepest apologies and respect. Richard. Isabella read the note 3 times. She looked up at Tony with wide eyes. Is this real? Very real. He was here for an hour this morning, quite humbled. Said watching you play changed his perspective on a lot of things. Tony studied her face. So what are you going to do? Because I'm guessing you won't be carrying trays much longer. Isabella thought about Catherine's offer. The practice space, the guidance, the chance to reclaim everything she'd lost. She thought about Patricia's call in the concert hall waiting for someone to fill its stage. She thought about her parents and how proud they'd been of her music. She thought about the girl in that old newspaper photo, so confident and full of dreams. I think, she said slowly, I'm going to try again. I'm going to be terrified every step of the way, but I'm going to try. Tony pulled her into a hug. That's my girl. You'll always have a place here if you need it, but something tells me you're meant for bigger stages than Romano's. Around them, the kitchen staff cheered again, and for the first time in 3 years, Isabella let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, the future could be bright again. 6 months had passed since that night at Romano's, and Isabella still couldn't quite believe how much her life had changed. She stood backstage at the Riverside Concert Hall, her hands clasped together to keep them from shaking. Through the heavy curtain, she could hear the audience filling the seats. Hundreds of people, all there to hear her play. Catherine appeared beside her, elegant in a navy dress. How are you feeling? Like I might throw up, Isabella admitted with a nervous laugh. Good. That means you care. Catherine adjusted the collar of Isabella's black performance gown. I've been doing this for 50 years and I still get nervous before big performances. The day you stop feeling nervous is the day you stop growing as an artist. Isabella took a deep breath. The past 6 months had been intense. Moving into Catherine's guest house had been just the beginning. Every morning she'd practiced for hours in Catherine's music room, relearning pieces she'd once known by heart, building up the strength in her hands, pushing herself harder than she ever had before. Catherine had been a demanding teacher, but also patient and kind. She'd helped Isabella work through not just the technical aspects of performance, but the emotional ones too. The fear, the doubt, the grief that still sometimes overwhelmed her when she played certain pieces that reminded her of her parents. They would be so proud of you. Catherine had told her one afternoon when Isabella broke down crying during practice. Your parents invested everything in your gift. The best way to honor them is to share it with the world. Those words had kept Isabella going through the hard days, the days when her hands ached or her confidence wavered. She had also started teaching a few students, young kids from the neighborhood who couldn't afford expensive lessons. Working with them reminded her why music mattered, how it could light up a child's face, give them a way to express feelings they didn't have words for yet. The check from Richard had cleared her medical debt completely, lifting a weight she'd carried for 3 years. She'd tried to thank him, but he'd been surprisingly hard to reach. Finally, she'd gotten a brief email saying he preferred to remain in the background, that her success was thanks enough. She'd heard through Tony that Richard had become much quieter, more thoughtful, less concerned with showing off. He still came to Romano's, but he treated the staff with genuine respect now. A stagehand appeared. 5 minutes, Miss Morrison, Miss Morrison. Not Isabella Mitchell, the waitress. Isabella Morrison, the pianist. She was reclaiming her real name, her real identity, piece by piece. I need to tell you something, Isabella said to Catherine suddenly. I don't think I ever properly thanked you. For everything. The house, the teaching, the belief in me when I didn't believe in myself. Catherine's eyes softened. Dear girl, you've already thanked me 100 times. But if you want to really show your gratitude, go out there and play your heart out. Let everyone hear what I've been hearing these past 6 months. They hugged, and then Catherine went to take her seat in the audience. Isabella was left alone with her thoughts and her nerves. She peeked through the curtain and spotted familiar faces. Tony was there with the entire staff from Romano's, all dressed up. She saw some of her new students with their parents. She even recognized a few music critics and journalists, people who could make or break a career with their reviews. And then she saw him. Richard, sitting in the back row, trying to be inconspicuous. Their eyes met for just a moment, and he gave her a small nod. No arrogance, no show. Just quiet acknowledgement. He'd bought a ticket like everyone else, come to support her like everyone else. Something about seeing him there, humbled and genuine, made her smile. People could change. She was living proof of that. The stage manager touched her shoulder. It's time. Isabella walked onto the stage as the lights came up. The applause was warm and welcoming. She'd worried people might have forgotten about the viral video, lost interest in the novelty of the Waitress pianist. But the concert had sold out within hours of tickets going on sale. Patricia from the concert hall said it was the fastest they'd ever sold an emerging artist series performance. She sat at the grand piano, so much more magnificent than the one at Romano's. She adjusted the bench, tested the pedals, let her hands hover over the keys. The audience fell silent, waiting. In that moment before she began, Isabella thought about the journey that had brought her here, the accident that had stolen so much. The 3 years of hiding in fear. The night Richard had forced her to play, unknowingly giving her the push she needed. Catherine's guidance. The strangers on the internet who'd shared her story and believed in her. The second chance she almost hadn't taken. She thought about a conversation she'd had with one of her students, a shy 10-year-old girl named Lily who struggled with confidence. What if I make a mistake? Lily had asked before her first recital. Then you make a mistake, Isabella had told her. You don't stop playing. You don't give up. You take a breath and keep going. That's what makes you a real musician, not playing perfectly but playing with courage. Now Isabella needed to take her own advice. She began to play. The piece was Chopin, the same composer she'd started with that night at Romano's, but a different work. More complex, more demanding, more beautiful. Her hands moved across the keys with confidence born from months of dedicated practice. The muscle memory was there, but so was something deeper. Emotion, story, truth. The music filled the concert hall, reaching the back rows, touching hearts. She played through the technical passages with precision, but she also played with vulnerability, letting the audience feel her journey through the notes. The grief of loss, the darkness of despair, the small spark of hope, the courage to try again, the joy of reclaiming something precious. As she moved into the second piece, then the third, Isabella found herself entering that special state where time disappears and nothing exists except the music. This was why she'd fallen in love with piano as a child. This feeling of being completely present, completely alive, completely herself. She played pieces her parents had loved, dedicating them silently to their memory. She played challenging modern compositions that showcased her technical skill. She played gentle, intimate melodies that made the huge hall feel small and personal. And for her final piece, she chose something unexpected. It was an original composition, something she'd been working on with Catherine over the past month. Isabella had never tried to write music before, but Catherine had encouraged her to express her own story, not just interpret others' work. The piece was called Rising, and it told the story of falling, of being broken, of finding the strength to stand again. The music was sometimes dark and dissonant, representing the pain and confusion. Then it would shift to uncertain, tentative notes like someone learning to walk after an injury. Finally, it built to a powerful, triumphant conclusion full of hope and determination. It wasn't technically the most difficult piece she played that night, but it was the most honest. When the final note faded, there was a moment of absolute silence. Then the audience exploded. People leaped to their feet, applauding wildly. Some were crying. Others were cheering. The ovation went on, and Isabella stood at the piano bowing, her own tears flowing freely. She looked out at the crowd and saw Catherine dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief. She saw Tony and the Romano's staff whistling and clapping. She saw her students bouncing in their seats with excitement. She saw Richard standing in the back, applauding steadily, a genuine smile on his face. But more than any individual face, she saw the collective power of human connection. These strangers had come together to experience something beautiful, and she'd been the one privileged enough to create it for them. This was why music mattered. Not for fame or money or recognition, but for this. The ability to touch souls, to remind people of their shared humanity, to create moments of transcendence in an ordinary world. The concert hall director came out with flowers. There would be photographs, reviews, interviews. Patricia was already talking about booking another performance, maybe a full recital next time. Someone from a recording label wanted to discuss a contract. The momentum was building, and Isabella was ready for it now. But in this moment, standing on this stage with applause washing over her, Isabella felt something she hadn't felt in 3 years. Peace. She was exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. Later that night, back at Catherine's house, they sat in the music room drinking tea. The house was quiet, peaceful. Through the window, Isabella could see her little guest house, the place that had become her sanctuary. "You know what I realized tonight?" Isabella said. "I spent so long being angry at Richard for forcing me to play that night. But in a weird way, he gave me a gift. A painful, humiliating gift, but a gift nonetheless." Catherine nodded. "Sometimes we need someone to push us off the cliff so we can discover we know how to fly. Do you think things happen for a reason?" Isabella asked. "The accident, losing my parents, the years of struggle, that night at the restaurant, all of it?" Catherine thought for a moment. "I think things happen, good and bad, and we decide what to make of them. You could have stayed bitter and broken. Instead, you chose to rise. That wasn't fate, Isabella. That was you," Isabella smiled. Her phone buzzed with messages of congratulations from people around the world who'd watched the live stream of the concert. The video was already trending online, but this time Isabella didn't mind. This time she wasn't running or hiding. She was standing in her truth, sharing her gift, honoring her parents' memory by living fully. She thought about the scared waitress she'd been 6 months ago, convinced her dreams were dead. That woman felt like a stranger now. The journey hadn't been easy, and there would be more challenges ahead. More performances, more pressure, more moments of doubt. But she was ready. She had Catherine's wisdom, the support of friends old and new, and most importantly, she had herself. The part of her that loved music so deeply that even 3 years of silence couldn't kill it. Isabella Morrison, the pianist, was back. Not as a perfect prodigy without scars, but as someone richer and deeper for having survived the darkness. Her music now carried weight that could only come from real loss and real healing. And that, Catherine told her, was what separated good musicians from great ones. As Isabella finally headed to bed that night, she paused at the piano in Catherine's music room. She sat down and played a few soft chords just for herself. Not for an audience, not for a video, not to prove anything. Just because she could. Just because the music was still there, always had been, always would be. And that was enough.